a lot of people, when they think about NATO, they've got this image of an automatic defense alliance or an automatic defense mechanism. So if one European NATO ally, let's say Poland, is attacked, the United States would automatically come to Poland's rescue, get involved in a war with Russia, and do everything it can in order to help Warsaw. But that's just not how it works. If Poland or Germany or any other NATO ally were to be attacked, the United States can choose how to react. Now, it could be that the United States chooses to go to war against Moscow to fight on behalf of those NATO allies, or it could be that the President of the United States writes a letter in which he expresses sympathy to the Polish or the German or the Lithuanian people and wishes them good luck. There is no automatic mechanism whereby one NATO member is obligated to help another NATO member militarily, even if that NATO member is attacked. That's just not how it works. In reality, all of this basically works on trust and it works on expectations. So everybody involved needs to believe that the United States would come to the aid of European NATO allies if they were going to be attacked. And if they don't, the entire alliance will essentially falter. And that matters most of all when it comes to Moscow. Most importantly, Vladimir Putin needs to believe that the Americans would be willing to risk New York or DC or Los Angeles in exchange for a European city like Warsaw. And if he doesn't believe that, it's only going to embolden him. It's going to make him more aggressive, and it makes it more likely that he's going to try his luck. And really, if you sit down and think about it for a moment, does anybody actually believe that Donald Trump would be willing to go to war against Vladimir Putin, against Moscow, against Russia, in order to defend Europe? I don't think so. Maybe you do. I definitely don't think that is very likely. And that is a serious problem, whether the United States leaves the alliance or whether it doesn't. They don't have to leave in order to destroy NATO. Now, of course, it could be that NATO makes a comeback once Donald Trump is no longer in office. He's an old man. He will eventually lose power. But I think there are three arguments against that. The first is just the nature of the Republican Party. So even though a lot of important Republicans do still believe in NATO, and they do think that it provides advantages to the United States, a lot of the younger Republicans, a lot of the more radical Republicans don't think that's the case. So just because you have a new president doesn't necessarily mean that American policy towards NATO is going to change drastically. It might just be that another Republican is in power and the rhetoric is slightly different, but more or less, they're going to follow the same path that Donald Trump is currently following. The second problem is Europe. So, like I said, NATO ultimately depends on trust and on expectations. And it obviously matters what Vladimir Putin thinks, but it also matters what Europeans think. And over the last couple of decades, when those Europeans got too comfortable in many ways, they did think that the United States would likely help them if something bad were to happen to them. That trust, I think, is largely gone. In much of Europe, the United States is simply no longer seen as a credible ally. And the result of that is that a lot of the European countries are starting to plan without the United States. Many of these countries are drastically increasing their defense expenditure, but it's not with a view to operate better with the United States, but to work without the United States, to be ready for a scenario in which they would have to fight without American help. And that ultimately is going to lead to more and more divergence between the Americans and the Europeans, which, again, I think is ultimately going to make it unlikely that NATO will go back to the way that it used to be. Last but not least, there's China. Not China as an actor directly, but China as a rising power. Europe simply isn't as important to the United States as it used to be. During the Cold War, this is where much of the conflict with the Soviet Union was taking place. The Soviet Union was America's most important adversary, and the United States poured endless resources into Europe. But that's not what the world looks like now. America's main problem now is not Russia, it's China. And people always joke about the pivot to Asia, this idea that ultimately Americans are going to expend more energy and more resources in Asia, and then they keep going back to the Middle East. But as time goes on, the Americans will almost inevitably spend more of their resources on Asia and less on Europe. And that's not really dependent on the president. Democratic presidents are going to focus more on China. Republican presidents are going to focus more on China. The world has simply changed.